So, Roger, I want to thank you again for being on this call with me. And I want to jump into some deeper spiritual questions here fairly quickly. But before we get to that, there was something you mentioned on Rick's podcast, Buddha at the Gas Pump, that I wanted to ask. And you mentioned, or he asked you about the fact that at one point you had the world record high diving off of a bridge. And he didn't ask you a couple of questions that I'm really curious about, which was, how old were you when you set that world record, and how high was the bridge?
Let's see. I think I was about 23, and I think the bridge was about 120 feet. And I need to add that, of course, that record has long since been broken.
So how, like 1 to 10, how scared were you? How nervous were you working up to that point?
Of course, it sounded like a great idea because I'd been doing competitive diving for a number of years and did competitive platform diving. And it seemed like a great idea. I did the math and I figured out how it could work. But of course, once I got up there and looked down, it was a lot further down than it seemed up. So I was terrified, but there was a camera crew down there below filming it, and I could either be filmed crawling back down from the bridge or diving off. So I dove.
And so you did a reverse somersault? Is that right? Is that the way you do that?
Yeah, you have to have some rotation so you can control the dive, and I do it. And one of the ways of doing that is a reverse somersault, that is moving forward and turning back, doing a back somersault. So that's one of the safer ways of doing it. I mean, safe is a relative term when you're coming from over 100 feet into water, which is like concrete at that speed.
Was that one of the peak experiences of your life, looking back?
Well, one of the nadir experiences, one of the lows, I don't know, take your pick. It was a painful experience at the time. It was, I'm very grateful to have done it. It gives me bragging rights and it makes a good story. And it also, for young males with all that testosterone flowing through, you know, there's the excitement of the challenge of pushing oneself to the edge and the limit and doing those kind of things. So yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way, but yes, I guess it was a kind of peak experience, and something that I think, you know, for young males in particular, there's just a high in pushing limits, even the risk of one's life, and that can take useful avenues, as in creative activities, etc., and sports, or it can take very destructive ones, as in conflict and war.
So then after you dove that, are you saying that you really didn't have that much of a high afterwards? Because I would imagine after that, you know, coming face to face with some serious fears and then not dying and then now having the world record at that time, I would imagine you'd be elated, right? Or
oh yeah, no, there was definitely a high afterwards, that's for sure. I'm very grateful for that. And yeah, that was a high. It was just the standing up on the bridge beforehand was a low.
God, I cannot imagine. Okay, so let's jump in. So let's dive in here. And it's clear to me, listening to some of your other interviews, that one thing you're passionate about is maps of psychological and or spiritual maturation or development beyond the conventional. So for folks who don't know what a map of development beyond conventional is, what is it? What are we talking about?
Well, of course, we've known for probably from the beginning of time immemorial that we grow mentally and psychologically from birth. But it was thought until very recently that psychological maturation really came to a halt, more or less when the body stopped growing. And one of the most exciting discoveries of the last 50 years in psychology has been the recognition that no, it doesn't stop, or it doesn't have to stop. It can stop, but we can also continue growing throughout adult life. And what developmental psychologists have begun to do is they've begun to map the stages of development on a whole variety of what are called developmental lines or aspects of mind, such as cognitive development, that is the way we process information, moral development, the way we make ethical choices, emotional development, sense making, the way we make sense of ourselves and the world, and on and on and on. Motivation, for example. We could add lots of other examples, but the general principle is clear. We can keep growing throughout adulthood, and frankly, we need to. And these stages beyond what we used to think of as normality are called post-conventional development, and now psychologists have mapped out several post-conventional stages. And it's looking more and more, and actually it's becoming very, very obvious, that what we took to be normality is actually a form of developmental arrest. So we as a culture, as a society, as a civilization, literally are suffering from a state of collective developmental arrest. But once you understand that, then a lot of the craziness and insanity and suffering in the world becomes understandable. You know, if you ask people, it's a really interesting question to ask. You know, as a species, what age do you think we are? Most people come up with adolescence. And think of us, human beings right now, as kind of in our adolescence, you know, having a lot of power and strength and energy and initiative and curiosity, and being pretty crazy and immature and creating suffering for ourselves and others.
So how do we know that our society or civilization is in an adolescent stage? And so are there cultures out there that are like at a further stage than our Western culture, or like how do we know? How do we be able to compare that to something else?
Well, we don't have any ideal cultures, obviously. You're only just us humans around.
Right.
But we can map individual development pretty accurately these days. And we can map with, you know, approximately where the center of gravity of cultures lies. And from that, it's clear that, yeah, there's some individual variation between cultures. Actually, on developmental scales, Europe tends to be a little more mature than American culture. So you can make those kind of comparisons, but we don't have any ideals, of course. Most cultures, by definition, at the conventional level. That's the definition of conventional. That's where most people are. But it's clear that some individuals lag behind, not even at conventional levels, say moral development, but the other individuals are exceptionally mature, and we now have significant evidence that certain practices such as meditation, contemplation, reflection, dialogue, exploration, introspection, these can foster maturation. So we know we have some tools for doing it. Of course, if we look back through the world's contemplative traditions, through the early philosophies, which really were about wisdom, you know, the name philosophia is love of wisdom, and early philosophies such as Greek philosophy and, of course, non-Western philosophies were very much about that. And so these traditions really spent a lot of their focus on how do we foster psychological well-being and maturation.
Do you personally know an individual that you would say is higher along or very advanced along one of these developmental dimensions, and which dimension might they be further along with, and what's some concrete like behavior or sign that yes, they are at that higher level? Just for example, so the audience can kind of sink their teeth into what we're talking about here.
Well, I would say that all of us know people who are more mature, but we probably haven't thought of them in that terms. We've probably thought of them as, oh, wise, healthy people that we look up to and admire and think they're doing good in the world. So yes, I'm very fortunate in knowing a number of those people, as you do probably, as most of our listeners do. I think an obvious example, who everyone knows, is Dalai Lama, who I've had the good fortune of meeting on a number of occasions. I think he's the warmest human being I've ever met. In his presence, you just feel wonderful. So I would say he's emotionally very mature, and I think he's morally very mature. He treats everyone, including the Chinese, with kindness and respect and compassion. His life is about helping and healing people and our planet. I think cognitively, he's also probably very mature indeed. I saw him in a debate with the chair of philosophy at Harvard University, and I'd call it a draw. So that's pretty impressive. So I think he's a wonderful example of someone who shows significant post-conventional development on a number of different aspects of mind. And it's no accident. You know, he went through from a young age, I think from about age 7, an extraordinarily intense training program of meditation, philosophy, debate, discussion, study, moral training. You know, he was really intensively trained to be the person he became. So it's no accident. And it's also wonderful because it points to the fact that, oh, maybe we can be a bit more like that. That'd be nice.
Are there spiritual maps and also psychological maps of development? Are those two different sorts of maps or two different dimensions? How would you describe that?
For the most part, they are different. And it's a very interesting question that you're asking there, Kevin. Most spiritual maps lay out the progression of states of consciousness that one can develop and cultivate through practices such as meditation. So, for example, you mentioned a lot of your audience are Buddhists, so one could think of, for example, the jhana states in Buddhism, which are states of increasing degrees and subtlety of concentration. One could also think of the classic stages of insight, which are the stages insight or Vipassana meditators go through. And those are effectively states of consciousness. You know you're in them. You can tell when you shift from one state to another. The experience is different. You know you're processing your experience in different ways. The mind is clearer, subtler, more precise, more concentrated. You can tell. But psychological maps are different in that they map the kind of, let's call it the basic operating system that the mind uses. And so the psychological stages of development, which have only really been mapped out in the last 50 years, whereas the contemplative maps of states of consciousness have been mapped for 2,500 years in many cases. But the psychological stages, it's like states of consciousness are like having a new app on your phone. It's like you get a new skill or a new capacity, but psychological maturation is like upgrading your operating system. And that's a kind of background process which you don't necessarily notice in your own experience. But other people may notice it. So, for example, a child developing through the process of what's called object constancy, where if you with a small child, if you get a really tall thin glass of water and pour it into a wider glass, the water isn't so tall in the wider glass, and the child will say there's less water in it. But show it to a kid a few years older, and they'll say, no, same amount of water. But they don't know they've gone through a developmental stage. And it's the same with us in adulthood. We don't necessarily easily recognize we've gone through a stage, but in retrospect, we may notice, oh, well, I'm seeing things I'm able to see things now from multiple perspectives instead of just one perspective. Or I'm much more comfortable with ambiguity, or things that do shift with development, but we don't necessarily notice the shift at the time. Is that making sense? Clear?
Yeah, no, yeah, for sure. I mean, and it seems to me like if a person is aware of these maps of development consciously, like they learn about it, then they can try to find where they are on certain dimensions and then look at the map and see, well, what is the next level of development for me in this dimension, and then start to take conscious action to grow into that next level. Can you, is there maybe one or two maps or resources that you can share with people of where maybe they can go to learn maybe one spiritual map of development and one more psychological map of development, if they're interested?
Well, there are, let's see, the maps of meditative development. Might look at the book by Daniel Goleman on meditation, and I forget the title of that book, Meditative Mind, I think it was, where he looks at different traditions, particularly Buddhism, and particularly the stages of insight meditation. But I have just realizing there's a little bit of there can be a trap here, because when you're practicing meditation or yoga, one of the traps that comes up is getting attached to particular states and trying to engineer them. And I have to say that I made the mistake of studying these maps while I was beginning meditation practice. And I think it probably put me back a year or two, because then in my achieving mind, I just tried to engineer and create these states and achieve things. And of course, as with so much meditation, the goal is, the practice is about simply being with your experience as it is, accepting it, allowing things to be, exploring everything, but not manipulating anything. And I did exactly the opposite, and it did not work. So there are some cautions, and I think if a person has a meditation teacher, they might discuss with them the value of reading some of these maps beforehand, and some of the traps. I remember one of my teachers asked me, an Indian teacher, have you done a lot of study of this practice? Oh, yes. Oh, such a pity. And it was a pity. Now, I don't think that's so much so for stages of adult development, because I think there your point is quite apt, that knowing about these stages can be valuable for a couple of reasons. One, they point to further possibilities. And second, they can show us where we are at our current stage, and some of the earlier stages we might still have aspects of our personality lingering at, and maybe they'll help us to let go and disentangle. So yes, and resources. Let's see, I would think of the article Suzanne Cook-Greuter, that's Cook-Greuter, and she has a very beautiful, long article, some 90 pages, on the web called 9 Levels of Increasing Embrace. And so that's a wonderful outline of her map. And then if people are really interested, you can go to the Vertical Development Academy, and for actually quite a lot of money, you can get yourself mapped. But the reason it might be worthwhile doing is because once you do the test and get mapped, then you get an hour or more consultation with the people, and it can be very valuable. It's like getting developmental counseling. I actually just did a week-long training program with them, and as part of that had to do the developmental map assessment. And I have to say, I found the debriefing up, it's very helpful. just showed me where I was still lingering and holding on to old ways of being, and oh yeah, maybe it's time to let those go.
So I'm curious if you've grown personally in any dimension in the last few years, and if so, how? If you'd be willing to share that.
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, I hope so. I've just got out of a 3-month meditation retreat. I hope it did something. But who knows? I can myself. I think well, certainly in contemplation, the challenge for me is after doing over 30 years of meditation practice, I've had a fair number of deep experiences, but what I don't have is the capacity for stabilizing those. And there's a big difference between a peak experience and between an altered state and an altered trait. So it's wonderful to have temporary experiences of love and compassion and joy and insight and wisdom. It's another thing indeed to stabilize those so that those are deeply embedded parts of personality and ways of being. And that's the challenge for me at the moment, is stabilizing some of these things.
Right. I know in your interview with Rick, there was this idea of people who have profound spiritual insights and yet still emotionally struggle. So those are two different dimensions. And by insight, I would imagine that there's a distinction between a sequence of words in your head that can sound true and profound, and that might not be always aligned with or happen with an authentic understanding behind the words.
Yes. So you're pointing to the idea that if you've got a certain degree of smarts, you can get the ideas and not necessarily have the underlying understanding.
Right.
And that's an old philosophical idea. Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, called it empty concepts. So you can have a concept of something, but not a lot of depth of appreciation of what it really means. And one of the things that happens as we grow in experience and understanding and hopefully wisdom is that the concepts begin to fill out and become deeper and broader and more personally meaningful and more personally impactful in our lives.
So let me ask you this. So in so many places in the spiritual books and the whole spiritual realm out there, transformative states of consciousness have been talked about a lot. And I believe, if my memory serves me correctly, you wrote a book on transpersonal psychology, right? And I also think it's true that for probably most of my audience, and myself included, we don't really think that we've ever been through a transformative state of consciousness, if that's even the right way to put that. So I'm kind of curious, are there higher states of consciousness that perhaps many people have been through without actually labeling it as such?
Well, we all go through a variety of states each day, and I think most of us have certainly had tastes of many profound states, moments in nature, moments appreciating great beauty, perhaps lovemaking, being in love. Being in love can be a very powerful state and a transformative one, and a very challenging one too, of course. So I think most of us have had tastes of these. The challenge with all of these is to transform older states into enduring traits. And that usually requires practice. And of course, contemplative practice of various kinds, meditation, Christian contemplation, yoga, whatever it is. And of course, we should add to that all the practices that usually go with them, such as living ethically, studying, finding a teacher, being with a community of like-minded people who are on the spiritual path. all those elements enable us to open us to transformative experiences and states, and also to stabilize them. And I should add, they foster psychological development, maturation as well. So, but these are practices, and that's the difference between living a life where, a nice experience, transformative experience might happen to you, and living a life which is committed to cultivating one's capacities and potentials and increasing likelihood, like dramatically increasing likelihood that we will be visited by these states and transformed by them.
And at the same time, not falling into the trap of being attached to being in those states or experiencing those states again, which is so easy because part of us really wants them, but yet we also have to just be in the moment. And if it happens, it happens. And if not, it's not, and just continue to be in that process.
Yeah, very good point. And it's very hard not to get attached to them, particularly when you're first starting out. And it's challenging to get attached to them. It's worse when we fall for traps thinking that we, for example, are way more mature than we are, or even most disastrously, that we're at some sort of condition called enlightenment, or we've come to the end of the path. Those are disastrous interpretations, and that's why we need peers and we need teachers to bring us down to earth and say, nice, that's nice, it'll go away, now you go back and practice.
Where can someone, or what's some good advice for someone who wants to find those peers and teachers to help them along the path? I mean, obviously you can go online and there's an infinite number of, options, but what's some advice you might have? Maybe number one, specific resources, or number two, just general guidance, principles of what to look for or what to watch out for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, finding peers and teachers is really important for psychological development and for contemplative practice and for any spiritual work of any kind. So you're pointing to a really important issue. And how well we do that largely determines how much we mature. And you're right, there are a lot of groups online these days, and so we're very fortunate that way that we, even if we live in parts of the country or the world where there isn't a lot of support for spiritual practice, we can find online communities. I think some of the things to look for are people who, and particularly teachers, who are part of a lineage, who have been authorized by their own teachers to teach, who therefore have some sort of checks and balances on themselves. And beware people making grandiose claims for themselves or for their community. Watch out for anyone who thinks that they have the only truth, or even worse, they're the only enlightened person on the planet. As Ken Wilber, who many of you probably know, he's a prolific author and a brilliant synthesizer, said, I know at least 10 people who think they're the only fully enlightened person on the planet. I'd just love to get them in a room together. So it's those kind of delusions are traps and giveaways. Of course, where the focus is mainly on raising money or something like that, or the idea that we are special and unique and have a mission, and therefore we're entitled to take shortcuts and do things which may be unethical. Those are really dangerous. I did a study, was part of a group studying cults at one stage, and I was very interested after I saw some of the cult members and realized some of them were very smart, idealistic people. And I could no longer fool myself that I might not fall for this too. So I was very interested in finding what were the traps they'd fallen for. And a couple of them stood out. One was thinking that your group was special and had a unique mission to save people, save the planet. Second was that that your mission was so important that it justified doing unethical things. And the third was, once you take the first ethical shortcut, the others come just so much more easily. So those were three things, kind of warning signs that I learned from that work. And let's acknowledge it, most people are trying to do part of spiritual communities and teaching and trying to do good. And they're just human beings. There aren't any perfect teachers. There are only people who teach, and some of them are a little more awake, but look for people who've done a lot of practice, who have their own teachers, who acknowledge they're still on the path and they're still learning, and they have friends and colleagues and teachers who they turn to for advice. Well, they're just a lot safer to be around.
Is there any specific resource you'd recommend people to check out if they're curious?
I think it depends largely on what people are interested in. It depends on what kind of practice a person is interested in. So it's a little hard to give specifics. I think, you mentioned a number of your audience are Buddhist practitioners, so there are lots of online teachings, very wonderful teachers available. Likewise, with almost any tradition at this stage. So I just encourage, first off, feeling into what really interests you and what kind of practice you're drawn to, and then looking for communities and groups online that have those, or even better, local communities, groups, and teachers.
I want to read to you a journal entry, and then I want to ask you a question. And the journal entry is this: today I focused on just the wonder of existence, of this present moment. And I thought perhaps humans' place in the world isn't to know the answers to the deepest questions, and instead to just be in awe and wonder. If so, then living from that place and putting the deeper questions to rest would be best. And also consider there very well could be beings far more advanced than us who have a deeper understanding of the purpose of life, and our species may very well just not have the faculties to understand or perceive it at that deeper level. And I assert that this would be okay, in part because there are important things we still do know, like love and altruism and beauty and the preciousness of this moment. What's your reaction to that?
Oh, well, first, deep appreciation and gratitude for someone who's feeling into their experience and opening to mystery and awe and acceptance of the unfathomable mystery of life. So I found it very beautiful and touching. First, there was a lot in that, so maybe we can unpack some of it. First, the person was writing about the beauty of just being in the present moment and just opening to that. And yes, you can look through any tradition, contemplative tradition or wisdom tradition, and you'll find so much emphasis on getting out of our mental constructions and fantasies in our heads and coming into direct contact with life and our experience in our body in this moment, this moment, this moment. It's like this moment is the closest thing we have to eternity. And it's in this moment, in our being in contact with life right now, that life itself and we really open and flower. So that was the first thing. I loved it. The second was the recognition that that this brought about an opening to awe, and to the recognition that maybe we don't understand everything, or maybe we can't understand everything. And again, I bow in admiration to this recognition. This is what's called epistemological humility, the recognition that epistemology is how we know, and epistemological humility is the recognition that we always are limited in what we can know. We're always bathed and surrounded and filled with mystery, level of mystery after mystery after mystery. And for me, one of the great freeing moments of life was when I realized that, I've spent my entire life thinking I had to understand things. And the reality is, life is bottomless mystery. And the person who wrote the journal talked about that maybe this is okay. Yes, it is okay. Mystery is the recognition of mystery is not feedback about personal failing. It's a deep existential recognition of the way things are. It's a recognition that this is the fundamental nature of reality, mystery. And that we may be like, we are probably like an ant that's lived its entire life underground in some tunnel underneath a basement in some suburb. And that's about as much of the world as it knows. And that's probably gives an example of about how much we know about life in the universe. And yes, we know an incredible amount, and hopefully in another 10 years we'll know, and 100 years we'll know even much more, and it'll still be a mystery within the context of mystery. And it's okay, and it's wonderful, and it's awesome and inspiring. Oh.
And then how do we, so that's on the one side, but then, and then on the other side, we have this desire to broaden our understanding and to deepen our understanding. And there's questions, there's a Jack Johnson song, which I think sums up three of the deepest questions there are really well. He says, why are we here? Where do we go? And how come it's so hard? Right? So these are specific questions. And so do we not pursue to deepen our understanding of answers to those questions and just say, well, it's unknowable, so we won't even bother with that? Or is there a balance? Well, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, you just answered it. The magic word is balance. It's the magic word for so much of life. And as with so much of life, and with wisdom, and one of the things that comes online as people mature is the recognition that it's not either or, it's both and. So yes, we live within the context of mystery, and simultaneously we want to understand and to grow and to reach into the fullness of our being and explore life as fully as possible. And it's wonderful. The problem is if we think we have to know or have to understand, then we suffer.
Right. In that interview with Rick, I believe you guys were talking a bit about how spiritual progress, if that's even the way to describe it, is often 90%, like 10% conscious and 90% unconscious. It's like sometimes we do these practices and then something just occasionally changes within us or something opens up. And it reminds me, I was listening to a podcast and I forgot her name, but she's a famous Buddhist teacher who worked in Silicon Valley, and she was like a computer nerd, and then she got really sick and she got into Buddhism meditation and she really took to it. And then now she's a a real high level teacher, and I forgot you mentioned levels of spiritual development in a Buddhist tradition, and I forgot what the word was. Basically, no, there was like a Sanskrit or whatever word, jhanas, the jhanas, right? And the way she explained it was she was going through these practices, and the way she was talking about it, it was, I don't think she had any attachment or even goal. She was just enjoying the process. And then within the process, at a certain point, she started having these experiences, and she didn't ask for them. She wasn't looking for them necessarily. They just kind of happened. And for me, when I think about my own spiritual practices, it's relieving to realize that consciously, it's not like consciously I'm going to figure something out and that's going to open the door necessarily. It's more like, hey, I'm just going to be doing these things. I'm going to be in the moment. And if something shifts, then that's great. And if it doesn't, you know what? I'm just going to continue doing what I'm doing. And the process is enjoyable anyways. So let's just kind of keep on doing it. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, you're giving a nice example of a well-balanced practice in which a person does the practice and simultaneously lets go attachment to the outcome. And that is the essence of the Indian yogic path of karma yoga. Karma yoga is the path of spiritual path in which one does one's work as fully and impeccably as possible, while simultaneously letting go attachment to the outcome, how things turn out. And of course, it's easier said than done, but you're making an important point that this is a key element to any spiritual path. That it's very easy to get attached to results. It's very easy to try to manipulate ourselves and the mind and to engineer progress. But for the most part, practices, and there are some exceptions, but for the most part, practices are best done with a balanced state of energy and some gentle effort, some intention, but not pushing or struggling or striving, rather opening to whatever experiences emerge in the moment. So I think you're pointing to something important there.
And by the way, just for the record, what I was just describing there is me in my best self. And 90% of the time, it's more like attachment and, oh shit, I want that good, that good state back. So I don't want to paint the picture like I'm more along the path than I am. So in a previous interview, you talked about the importance of that experience you had when you came to California and you came in contact with that master therapist who you said cracked you open in a way that you didn't think was possible and showed you an inner world you had no clue that existed, and you found a wealth of inner guidance. How did he crack you open? Was there hypnosis involved? What was that experience like?
Yeah, I had the very good fortune shortly after I came to California to go into therapy with a man by the name of James Bugenthal, who was truly a master therapist. And I was just beginning to do psychotherapy on people myself. I figured I had a moral obligation to go into it myself as a way of just seeing what it was like. I wasn't expecting a great deal, and I got way more than I expected. What I had the privilege of finding was that I was with a man who was extremely interpersonally sensitive, who was more in touch with what was going on with me than I was myself, and who was able to feed back to me subtle changes in emotion or body posture or vocal tone that I was quite unaware of. So, for example, I would say something and he would respond, Roger, as you said that, you're I noticed you hunched in your chair a little bit and your voice went down. You didn't look at me. I'd say, what? What are you talking about? And then a couple of months later, he'd give that kind of feedback, and I'd say, yes, it did happen. And a couple of months after that, it's like, yeah, you know, you're right. When you asked me that question, I got scared, and I contracted, and I pulled away from our contact, and it was like I got defensive, and I could feel myself contracting. Then a couple of months later, it'll be like, yeah, you're right. When you said that, I got defensive, and I had this immediate fantasy or memory of being insulted as a kid and feeling scared and childlike and just contracting, and so he basically trained me to be aware of my own experience and to be in touch with the remarkable richness of our inner world, the images, the thoughts, the fantasies, the feelings, the muscle tones and patterns that are constantly changing in these kaleidoscopic patterns, but usually go unnoticed. And if we become aware of them, then we find that they are these gold mines of information about what's going on with us and where we're getting hooked and caught and trapped and making ourselves small. And if we are aware of them, then we can become free of them. So being in therapy with Jim Bugenthal was like being hooked up to a human biofeedback machine, being with someone who could feed back to me the states of mind I was in, bring my attention to them, sensitize me to them until I could recognize the subtleties and information and richness and wisdom within each moment of experience. And then I was hooked up to my own, biofeedback machine. Then I could moment by moment, and still can, fortunately, check in, see what I'm feeling, what feels right to do, what I was missing in the situation, how I could best relate to this person, etc. So and I'm not, I feel very gifted to have had this pointed out to me. But of course, the more important lesson is all of us have these capacities, but in our culture, we have not been taught how to access them. Now, individuals differ in their skills. Some people are much more sensitive and intuitive than others. I was on the far end of the spectrum. I was very intellectual and heady and stuck in my thoughts and my inner world of thoughts and fantasies and out of touch with experience to a large extent. So I needed some remedial education. But all of us, I think, can become more sensitive to our inner world. And one of the things we now know is meditation is a wonderful practice for doing that.
What's your advice to someone who would like to find a therapist similar to the one that you had? And obviously a tremendous amount of good fortune was part of that experience.
A tremendous amount of good fortune was part of that experience indeed. And I have to say, I was not mature or wise enough to know how mature and wise a person I was sitting with. It took me a significant amount of time, but I'm extremely grateful. So I think there are several things. One is the research is clear. The most important thing about the therapeutic relationship is about the therapy situation is the quality of the relationship. Do you feel really good with this person? Do you feel comfortable? Do you click? That's really important. Another thing is how much inner work has the person done? Have they been in therapy themselves? Have they done meditation? Have they done a yoga practice? What have they done for their own growth and maturation? And it turns out that those things are much more important than the degrees they may have. I spent a lot of time getting degrees, but the research data is crystal clear. The quality of the person is more important than the degrees hanging on the wall. So ask friends, ask people who've been in therapy with people. And remember, as a client going into psychotherapy, you get to choose. And it is perfectly appropriate, though almost no one does, but it is perfectly appropriate to go into an initial therapy with someone with the idea that you're doing an interview on them as much as they're doing it with you. You want to find out about them. You want to find out how much inner work they've done, what their experience was, whether they've been in therapy, and you want to know whether you feel good with them. And it really can be really smart to interview a few therapists. You know, most people just end up with the first therapist whose office the door they open. Well, you know, it can be okay, but why not give yourself a chance to first ask as many people as you can about different therapists, and then interview them and see what works and whether it clicks.
Yeah, I can imagine if you go and talk to, let's say, 3 different therapists, you have that introductory session with 3 different ones. Out of those 3, one of them is probably going to stand out to you, right? And it could have been the number 2 or the number 3 person that you would have never met had you just jumped on the first bandwagon. So let's switch gears a little bit here. The use of psychedelics as tools for spiritual awakening is experiencing a resurgence right now. And I'm curious, do you have any personal experience with using psychedelics for spiritual awakening that you'd like to share?
Let's see. Well, I actually did some research on this, and I had the very good fortune of being able to study and interview some of the real pioneers in this field. And actually that came about from a very interesting bit of personal history. My late wife, the psychologist Frances Vaughan, was a subject in one of the original psychedelic research programs. And it radically changed her life. She had a profound mystical experience, which was actually so profound it's been written up. It's on the web if people would like to read it. It's a classic, profound mystical experience, which was life-changing. And then I met a number of other people who'd been subjects in that same study. And they all said their lives had been changed. And I just said, wow, that's interesting. So I began to think, you know, we still have with us most of the pioneer researchers who did the early studies, who watched as hundreds, in fact, thousands of people were subjects in research studies back in the 60s and 70s. And those people are getting old and they're going to die soon. So we really should get what we can from them while we can. And so I was fortunate in getting some funding and got a group of these people together. And we brought them together actually for the last time. We had wonderful people like Ram Dass and Houston Smith, the great religious scholar, and Stan Grof, who has probably supervised more psychedelic sessions than anyone in history, and even Albert Hoffman, the discoverer of LSD. They all came together for the last time, and we were able to interview them and find out what their understanding of the mind and human nature and human potentials was from their perspective as having seen more profound and transformative experiences than anyone in human history. And we actually published that as a book called Higher Wisdom. Let's see, Higher Wisdom, what was the subtitle? Eminent Elders Explore the Continuing Impact of Psychedelics. So those are wonderful interviews if anyone is interested. And there were several things that came out. One is they discovered that if you simply provided a safe environment, then the psyche has this innate tendency to open, to heal, to self-actualize, and to self-transcend. So they learned that the psyche has its own innate drive and ability to actualize, to grow, to heal, to transform. So that was a really powerful and important discovery. They also discovered that very deep psychopathologies, old wounds, old traumas, could be healed sometimes with remarkable rapidity under psychedelic psychotherapy. That was another thing. They discovered that sometimes these experiences would just be wonderful experiences and then they'd pass, but for other people, they really were life-changing. And some of the things which made a difference and made them more life-changing was whether the people were prepared, whether they had an orientation towards psychological and spiritual growth, and whether they took up some practice for continuing psychological spiritual growth afterwards. So those were some interesting lessons. And then there was another study I did in which I interviewed, I think, 5 or 6 spiritual teachers who had had very profound openings, call them classic enlightenment experiences, as part of their practice and had similar experiences from psychedelics. And so I wanted to know, well, what do they think about the role of psychedelics? And they were unanimous in saying that they all thought psychedelics could be very valuable, provided they were used in the context of an ongoing practice. By themselves, they were hit and miss. But if used in the context of an ongoing spiritual practice, meditative, contemplative, yogic, inquiry, reflection, therapy, whatever, then they could be really, really valuable catalysts and speed psychological healing and maturation and opening.
Some people who have used psychedelics for spiritual purposes report that it's reduced their fear of death. And I know that there's been studies, I think at Johns Hopkins, using either mushrooms or MDMA for late stage cancer patients to reduce their anxiety of death. Have you had any of those experiences where your fear of death has been reduced based on these experiences?
Let's see. Well, I think you're referring to studies, two generations of studies. The first by Stan Grof and his colleagues at, I think, right, Johns Hopkins, using LSD, and then more recently, studies by Charles Grob at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles. And I think he used psilocybin, but I'm not sure on that. And yes, in both cases, these were people who were near death, who were facing their own mortality, and who were suffering a significant degree of anxiety, understandably. And there was a dramatic reduction in a large number of these people in their death anxiety. And most clearly, it seemed like the major impact came when people had a profound mystical experience. It seemed that that was the most transformative aspect of the psychedelic experience itself, was an actual mystical experience, some sort of transpersonal opening that opened the person to their own deeper identity, their profound interconnection and unity with the universe, with humanity, with life, with the world, etc. Those really changed and reduced death anxiety.
Yeah, personally, I've experienced psychedelics before. I've never had spiritual experiences, or what I would describe as spiritual experiences, while on them. However, I did have one using cannabis. And I think the difference was I had set up the environment and the setting to be very calm. This wasn't a party situation. This was a serious, I'm doing this for spiritual reasons. I'll be very, meditative. And that, at least once in my life, helped facilitate a much deeper experience than I've normally experienced.
Yeah, you rediscovered the principles that the early pioneers discovered, which they called set and setting. Set being the environment, the conditions, the people we're with, and sorry, setting, that's the setting, and set being the intention we bring to it. You know, if you take it to go have a good time at a party, maybe you'll have a good time at a party. If you set it to have a profound spiritual experience, then there's no guarantee, but it's much more likely. And if you do it in the company of a wise guide, or perhaps a wise fellow explorer, then it's much more likely than, you know, with a random group of people. Well, as the saying goes, be very careful who you do psychedelics with, because unless you're willing to share their mind, because you will.
Okay, so let's, we only have a couple minutes left, so let me ask you one sort of final topic, which is, I'm curious if you're familiar with Ian Stevenson's work on kids or children recounting experiences from past lives. Have you heard of that work?
Yeah, Ian Stevenson was one of the pioneers in this area. There have been a number of people who followed his work. I think what was impressive about Ian Stevenson was he was a university faculty, I believe. He was a psychiatrist, I believe. He was very careful, cautious. He never made outright claims that this was reincarnation. He always talked about experiences with reincarnation. So he was sober and sensible and cautious, which is what you want in someone doing research on a field which is likely to be dismissed by conventional researchers. And there's some interesting cases there. I haven't studied them closely, so I don't pretend to be an expert, but they're interesting. What you make of them is another question. Reincarnation has been a theme in a variety of spiritual traditions, particularly the ones out of India. You find it in certain parts of the Western tradition too. And let's go back to your point before about the bottomless mystery of life. Who knows?
Do you personally believe in reincarnation, or have your views on that shifted over time?
I don't. It's not something I give a lot of attention to. I think there are a lot of problems with the idea, and I don't know how one would definitively decide for sure. So it's not something I find terribly important. The Buddha was asked this question, and he said, well, if there's no future life, then obviously you'd want to live this one as fully, as completely as you possibly could, and live as kindly and well as you could. You'd just want to make the most of it. And if there's another one, well, you'd want to prepare yourself for it by living this one as well as and ethically as you possibly could, and being as nice as you could. So that was a great answer. Don't know. One piece of wisdom that keeps coming in this path is don't know. It's okay not to know. I don't know.
Awesome, Roger. Well, thank you so much. I think that's a good place to wrap up the interview. If people want to find out more about your work, where do you recommend they go?
Let's see, I have a website, drrogerwalsh.com. So on that, you'll find an enormous amount of free stuff, talks, dialogues, articles, chapters, links to various interesting things. Also find a list of my books, probably the most interesting for members of this community and audience would be Essential Spirituality, the 7 Central Practices. That's about the 7 practices that seem to be universal across contemplative traditions, and things like transforming emotions, developing concentration, living ethically, contributing and serving others. So that might be helpful to people. There are a lot of other things there, so please explore, and I hope it'll be helpful.
Yeah, and I do suggest, if people are interested, to go check out your book on spiritual practices. I think one wonderful thing about that book is that it includes very concrete, specific practices. So it's not just lofty ideas. You're going to sit down and here's a visualization for you to go through, for example. And that's what the whole book is these concrete practices, which really, I think are wonderful. So Roger, thanks again so much for talking to us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.